Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come into his presence with singing. Know that the Lord is God. It is he that made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name. For the Lord is good. His steadfast love endures forever, and his faithfulness to all generations.
By entering into faith into what God has always wanted to do for us, set us right with him, make us fit for him, we have it all together because with God of our Master Jesus. And that's not all. We throw open our doors to God and discover at the same moment that he has already thrown open his door to us. We find ourselves standing where we have always hoped we might stand, out in the wide open spaces of God's grace and glory, standing tall and shouting with praise. There's more to come. We continue to shout our praise even when we are hemmed in with troubles, because we know how troubles can develop passionate patience in us, and how that patience in turn forges the tempered steel of virtue, keeping us alert for whatever God will do next. In alert expectancy such as this, we're never left feeling shortchanged. Quite the contrary. We can't round up enough containers to hold everything God generously pours into our lives through the Holy Spirit. Christ arrives right on time to make this happen. He didn't and doesn't wait for us to get ready. He presented himself for this sacrificial death when we were far too weak and rebellious to do anything to get ourselves ready. And even if we hadn't been so weak, we wouldn't have known what to do anyway. We can understand someone dying for a person worth dying for. And we can understand how someone good and noble could inspire us to selfless sacrifice. But God put his love on the line for us by offering his Son in sacrificial death while we were of no use whatever to him. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You probably know this, but it's not easy being a loyal United Methodist in American culture today. It's not easy being a part of any mainline church denomination, for that matter. Now, this state of affairs represents a dramatic shift from the time that my fellow baby boomers and I were coming of age. And for those of you from an earlier generation, the shift that we have experienced over the last 60 years is even more striking. So this confusion is felt by most of our laity and by our pastors too. A few years ago, I was talking to an older colleague of mine who had been in the pastoral ministry for nearly 40 years. And one time he said to me, just with dismay, with a furrowed look on his face, "Nothing I know what to do works anymore." By that, he meant that the programs and the activities and the initiatives that he would get his churches to start that used to bring people into the church no longer had any success. A few years later, I heard another prominent voice in our church make this statement. He said, "Our culture," meaning American culture, "used to push people towards church." Think about that. When I was growing up, that was true. The culture encouraged people to join a church, to be a part of a faith community. When you moved to a new town, especially in the South, what was one of the first questions someone asked you? Where do you go to church? And if they didn't have one, you said, well, come on to church with me. That was just normal. And that's no longer the case. And in my work, I traveled to churches all over the Tennessee area, many of them struggling in small towns and other communities, uncertain about what they're supposed to do now. And they say, the world is changing, and nothing we know how to do works anymore. We want to get people in, and we don't know how. And so in our conversations, when I'm with these churches and with the lay people especially, I try to ask a few questions to help them think or recognize how different the world is these days. And I'll say, when you were growing up, how many businesses were open on Sunday morning? How many? The answer was 0. Nothing was open. Now we get mad if our store isn't open at 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. I'll say, how many restaurants offered Sunday brunch at 10 o'clock in the morning? You couldn't eat anywhere. Even a McDonald's wasn't open on Sunday morning. How many soccer games were scheduled for grandkids and kids back then? Nobody even played soccer. How many church members had to work on Sundays? Just a handful in a few industries or businesses that had to stay open. How many people could stay home and watch a video or movie of their favorite television show at any time, including Sunday morning? Nobody. In a lot of places, church was the only game in town on Sunday morning. And so when we ask these kinds of questions and think about the contrast, we realize how different our context is now for us to live out our faith. And when we add to that social change, we add to that the fact that nuns and duns make up an increasing portion of our population, especially among younger generations. We've got a whole different situation. Y'all know what nuns and duns are, right? They're the people, when asked, what's your religious affiliation, they'll say, none. Or they'll say, I'm done with church. I'm finished. I'm not going back. So the short-term talk is nuns and duns. So the nuns and duns are increasing. So we've got this changing world around us, and this change brings uncertainty and anxiety. And so many places try even more desperate programs and activities to get people to come back into the church. And when those don't work, the anxiety goes up. About a year ago, I was in Memphis with a church that was struggling, and one of the things they tried was a festival in the park across the street, and they had all this activity and all these people there serving things and handing out water and all that. And I asked them, so what was the purpose of that event? And they said, well, we wanted to just get the neighbors to come to church. And I said, well, how many have come? And they said, none. It didn't work. But that's what you used to do. It's just to have a big activity and folks would just sort of naturally gravitate into the church. It's not going to happen. So what is the answer in this new era? We know it's not a program. It's not just one activity. But as Stephen said, what we heard at our Methodist gathering this week, the focus is on now, instead of trying to first get people in the building, we recognize that we are all called to be missionaries in our own way. We're all called to be in conversation and initiating relationships with new people and then seeing what develops. And in this way, our challenge is much more like the situation of the early church than the situation was when I was coming up along the church. You see, we live in a culture where the church is an outlier. It's strange. It's even scary for some people. Some people are even afraid of what the church will do because of popular images of judgment and condemnation. So our task as people trying to witness to life-giving faith is to be a part of a movement that goes outside the walls of the church, that looks to connections outside the programs of the church, to begin to relate one-on-one with people who need the gospel. That's why Paul was so effective at the start of the early church, because he had had such a dramatic transformation in his life. Remember, as a Pharisee, he was proud of his faithfulness to the law, to his focus on obedience, and his desire to make sure everybody else obeyed the law the way he did. He was what we would call a fanatic. And that's why he was trying to stamp out Christianity. He felt that the followers of Jesus were not doing Judaism right. So he needed to get rid of them. And he's on his way to Damascus to persecute people, to bring them back to Jerusalem so they could be punished. And you know what happened. The Spirit of God knocked him off his horse, blinded him, gave him a whole new voice to understand what God is and what God wants. And so this transformation that led him to be then someone who had to be taken care of by the Christians he was trying to persecute, Ananias and the others in Damascus. That contrast of his zealousness for law and righteousness and virtue and obedience with the gracious welcome and nurture and blessing that he experienced from Christians. It was that contrast that truly awakened in him the recognition that what he had been doing was the wrong thing. What he'd been focused on in terms of rules and order and judgment, scolding, was not the way to be obedient anymore. The way was to receive the grace that God was offering in Jesus and the grace that the Christian community offered. So that's why he writes these things like he did in Romans 5, that this is what God has always wanted to do for us, to set us right with him, that is, have a good relationship with him. And in Peterson's words, we throw open our doors to God and discover at the same moment God has already thrown open his door to us. We find ourselves standing where we always wished we could stand, in the wide open spaces of God's grace and glory. And God is with us even in the struggles. That the Spirit of Christ is there undergirding us and strengthening us and giving us hope even when we can't find it ourselves. So this is the kind of witness that I believe we're called to do. To be faithful Methodists or Presbyterians or Baptists or Church of Christ or disciples, whatever. It's to be a gentle witness into the world. To go out and begin new relationships, to just engage with people in a way that offers the kind of gracious, thoughtful, welcoming ear, hand that someone might need. So this is what the church is going to have to do if it's ever going to really be renewed. It's going to be based on one-on-one conversations that may or may not lead to new church members, but will be actual embodiments of God's grace. Gentle witness is just being there for others in a way that gives a person hurting, a person lonely, a person scared, a sense of love I'll give you an example of what a gentle witness looks like. It's one of my favorite stories. A woman I know had probably the most difficult kind of childhood I could imagine. She's now in ministry, and I serve on her board of advisors. But when she tells her story about the power of grace and what I would call gentle witness, it's moving beyond measure. Both of her parents were alcoholics. And when she was 12 or 13, they essentially sold her into the sex trafficking business so they could make money for their addiction. She was a mother before she was 15. She was a drug addict by the time she was 20. She served time in prison, multiple sentences. When she was around 40, she was completing her sentence for assault and found herself back in her old neighborhood, around all the same people who had helped lead her down that path of chaos to begin with. But there was one friend, one woman she knew who had been a prostitute with her, who had found Magdalene House. Do y'all know what Magdalene House is? That ministry here in town that serves women on the streets. It's just a remarkable ministry. And so this friend had been embraced by Magdalene House and had turned her life around, completely changed her direction. And she came to Clemmy and she said, I want you to do this with me. And Clemmy, the woman, said, no, I don't need that. So she went back to the crack house where she lived and began to turn back to her former life. But one day, for who knows what reason, she found herself just desperately wanting to get out of that destructive lifestyle. And so on a whim, she called her friend and said, I'm willing to give it a try. I'm willing to go with you to Magdalene House. And her friend, a gentle witness, raced over there before she could change her mind, forced her into her car and drove her to Magdalene House. Clemmy, the woman, remembers driving with her friend, and as they got closer and closer to the destination, she began to have natural second thoughts. She wanted her friend to turn around the car or drop her off so she wouldn't even try, because she was convinced in her mind nobody in that ministry could understand her. Nobody would really be able to reach her. She was terrified of what she was going to encounter. But it was too late. Her friend had gotten them there, forced her out of the car. They were walking down the sidewalk toward the front door of the ministry. And before they got halfway, Becca Stevens, the Episcopal priest, the founder of Magdalene House, came around a corner and with a big smile and with open arms came up to Clemmy and embraced her. And what Clemmy says when she tells that story is she said, I never had been hugged like that before in my life. Imagine being 40 years old and never having been hugged. But you see what a gentle witness did there. Connected, reassured, and blessed her, and opened up the possibility of transformation, which is still bearing fruit 20 years later. See, a gentle witness is so much more effective than an angry witness, a desperate witness, an anxious witness. A gentle witness is simply that willingness to connect with one of God's children, to be present, thoughtful, and responsive in whatever way. What happens after that, we don't have to control. All we're asked is to be that kind of voice and listening ear and gracious welcomer to the people that are hurting. And it won't be as dramatic as that encounter between Becca Stevens and Clem. It might simply be talking to a waiter who came to Nashville to make it big in the music business and won't ever go anywhere in that career. It may be engaging with a checkout clerk at a store, finding out she's struggling to make ends meet with 2 kids and not enough money. It may be your neighbor whom you really don't know, but who has been in depression for a while. Any one of those situations can be an occasion for gentle witness, which is simply the desire to offer to somebody the grace of God that we have received. A grace of God that is freeing and comforting, redeeming, and life-giving. It's hard to be a loyal United Methodist today. And we won't fix it by a big program or activity or new initiative. But I do believe with consistent and persistent gentle witnesses, we will renew the church one relationship at a time. Amen.